Well, certainly the lessons that we've learned are exactly what we've been talking about, is that the more collaboration and sort of open and honest work that you can do with people up front, the better off the project's going to be. And I always find that going out into the field, like onto the project site with people and walking it and listening, being very open and listening to what people's values are and what their objectives are for that landscape, and recognizing that they don't always match our own, and that people do have different languages and cultures. And the thing is listening to people and working collaboratively with them and adjusting the prescription and doing that all up front. I think that's what we've learned, and I think we're better at it now.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode was a really, really cool one. We're talking about logging a national park. Right? Just let you think about that for a second. So, we're talking about Jasper National Park in Alberta, Canada. And they had a bit of a pine beetle problem, a bit of a fuel buildup problem right around town, and it was beyond the ability of prescribed fire to deal with safely. So they decided to go with harvesting, mechanical fuel removal. And this is the story of how they came to that decision, some of the issues they ran into while making that decision, who they got to do the actual mechanical fuel removal, to do the actual logging, the things they learned, would they do it again, why they did it, all this kind of cool stuff. It was such a cool experience for me to be able to talk to these folks about this. I'm not actually going to even introduce them all because there's so many of them. There's actually 4 guests this time around. I think it's the most I've had on the go. And 3 representatives from Jasper and 1 from Canfor, actually. Canfor is the company who was given the contract to do the actual harvesting within Jasper. And yeah, it was just such a really cool experience to talk about and listen to them talk about their collaborative effort and the lessons they've learned and how they've both Jasper and Canfor have kind of grown as a result of this and realized some things that they hadn't realized before. And it was just such a great story about how if we work together, the amazing things we can accomplish. So I hope you like it. It was incredible for me. They're all going to introduce themselves as they go through, so you'll get to meet them all. And I can't wait to get started. So let's just dive into it. Sponsors for this episode. West Fraser is the #1 sponsor for this podcast for 2022. I could not do this without their help. Thank you, West Fraser. Greenlink Forestry is another sponsor. Again, couldn't do it without them. They've been with me since the beginning. Damaged Timber is another sponsor. Go to damagedtimber.com, put in Your Forest 10 at checkout to get 10% off. They put damaged timber in your home. Go to the website. You'll find out what it is. And finally, Forest Proud is a partner. They've been with me for just a couple months now, and they are supporting forests as climate solutions. They want to keep forests as forests, and I appreciate their help with everything that they're doing. So yeah, without any further messing around, let's dive into this weird and wacky upside down world where we log national parks. But it's for a good reason. And in the end, you find out that it all makes sense. So yeah, here we go. So first of all, whose harebrained idea was it to log one of the world's most precious natural parks? No, I'm kidding. My point in saying that is that it's a bold thing to do, right? Like you did your homework and you knew what some of the public ramifications might have been of trying to do something like this. So I'm assuming, David, you probably want to speak to this a little bit. Maybe just introduce yourself first, and then we'll get into how this came about.
Yeah, so I'll give that a start, and then I'll probably get Landon to fill in some of the blanks there. So my name's Dave Argument. I'm the Resource Conservation Manager here in Jasper National Park, which means I'm responsible for the wildfire and prescribed fire management program, along with a few other natural resource management oriented programs in the park. And I came back to Jasper from an earlier point in my career where I worked here 20 or so years ago. I came back here about 5 years ago, kind of into the very peak of our mountain pine beetle outbreak. I didn't quite appreciate when I accepted the job to return to Jasper that I'd be coming to find pine beetle ripping through the pine forest here. The epidemic is now largely past, but we're left um, uh, with the legacy of that in the landscape now. In the end, we've had something like 230,000 hectares of pine beetle impacted pine forest in the valley bottoms throughout Jasper. And I know our neighbors to both the east and the west, BC and Alberta, are BC's lived through that now, and of course is still living through the legacy of that. Alberta is still struggling with pine beetle in the landscape at this point, and the impacts are pretty profound. So in a place like this, where we have been managing fire in various ways for since the park was established in 1907. Obviously, Indigenous management of fire was something different before park establishment, and probably more effective than what we've been doing more recently. We spent the early part of the 1900s focused on the idea that fire on the landscape was bad, putting every single fire out. And then only more recently came to understand that actually fire has a very important role to play in the landscape in a place like this, and in a landscape like this where we're not actually engaged in commercial forestry activities, where we're protecting and preserving the forest in theory in a more natural state. Although that can be argued, of course, as well.
I like how we're getting to it right off the bat here.
That's right. That's right. We'll get into it pretty quickly, I'm sure. Keeping fire off the landscape for such a long time, along with a few other management actions and decisions that Parks Canada made in the early days, has resulted in basically Jasper being an even-aged monoculture of pine throughout an awful lot of the valley bottom, where we used to have a lot more broken vegetation patterns and variety and variability here. And of course, pine, lodgepole pine, is a very fire-driven forest type. So we fought that fire for a long time and then started trying to put fire back on the landscape. But it's hard to catch up after that long of putting all the fires out, or trying to put all the fires out. So when the pine beetle epidemic crept over the Continental Divide and got into Alberta, this place was just ripe for the picking. Of course, we had 100-year-old pine forests, a few warmer winters that didn't knock the pine beetle out of commission, and then some hot, dry summers, drought conditions, and for a few years that weakened those forests as well. So the pine beetle just ripped through here, resulting in that 230,000 hectares of impacted forest. And we've got this community of Jasper sitting right smack in the middle of it. 5,000 people, permanent residents here, and then that grows significantly in the summertime when the tourist season is on. A lot of people sitting right here in the path of potential wildfire that would be much more severe, tearing through a dead pine forest with these red dead needles in the canopy, and basically unbroken from here all the way to the BC border. About 14 kilometers to the west of us is the border with British Columbia, and it's just a wide open valley of severely impacted pine forest with a prevailing wind that would push a fire right onto the community. So we looked at ways to try to break that up and improve our resilience to the threat of wildfire and deal with wildfire risk reduction in a variety of ways. We've had prescribed fire units planned to the west of the community here for years, where we've been intending we got to put some fire on the landscape there and break it up a little bit to serve as a bit of a guard to the community. This is before pine beetle. We were planning this. But prescribed fire in an environment like this takes very specific weather conditions to be able to pull it off. It has to come into prescription, and it's a rare thing to get it just perfect so that we know we can do it safely. And with the risk to a community like this right on the edge of those planned units, that's just too high a risk. It's got to be just right, or we risk losing control of it. And we just weren't getting the right conditions. Then the pine beetle comes through, and now we realize that there's no way we're ever going to get the right conditions to allow us to burn this area with this dead pine forest right on the edge of a community like Jasper. So that's when we started casting around, looking at, well, what are the other options for reducing the fire risk in this community? And the obvious choice here is to remove that fuel load from the landscape mechanically. So it was never, obviously we're not out to do commercial logging in a national park. That was never the intent in any way. This was really about improving the fire risk situation for this community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but it all makes sense to me, right? When I first heard this story, like it all checks the boxes. But I imagine for you folks at parks, looking at this situation going, okay, we got these standing matchsticks that are ready to go up at any time. We've got this homogeneous, layer of trees and dead wood, and just the whole forest is ready to go up in flames. How do we manage this? How do we reduce this risk? And then going, I know, we'll log it. That had to have been like, well, okay. Like there must have been a whole chain of command, a lot of conversations, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of discussion around public perception before you even went looking for somebody to do this work.
Yes, absolutely. This is an unusual project in a national park, but it's become more and more common, especially in the mountain parks here. There have been projects that are modeled after this now happening in Banff as well to deal with some of the fire risk of that community. But when we started thinking this way, it's a big mind shift change for a park manager to think, yes, we're going to log in our national park. If you go way back in time, there was commercial logging happening in Wood Buffalo at one point in time, but that's back before we were, as diligent and careful and principled, I think, in how we're managing these places as we are now. So in the modern era, logging in a national park is just not something, in Canada anyways, it's not something it's not a go-to tool by any means.
Sure.
So thinking about that as the only way to protect this community, we've done some cutting of fire guards before. We have a community fire guard here that was logged, I don't know, about 20 years ago. Landon, maybe I'll let you speak about when the community fire guard went in.
Yeah, it was actually back in the 80s that it was first started, and it started small and gradually got bigger and bigger. It started with a horse logging effort. It was then replaced by a little bit more conventional logging effort, and that was the creation of the initial community fire guard. Maybe Matt, I'll just
introduce
myself. Yeah, I'm Landon Shepherd. I'm the fire and vegetation specialist here in Jasper National Park, and one of the people tasked with trying to make David's life a little simpler and deal with some of the larger problems that are our responsibility as managers of this land base and stewards of this land base right now. So I think an important point about dealing with a forest that has been heavily impacted by mountain pine beetle and where we had to come from, Matt, before we could get to a place where we were looking at applying logging as a tool to mitigate risk was that, there is a tendency to want to push an easy button. And if you just went to logging as a solution, sure, you can remove forest. We're quite capable of doing that as a species, but it gets away from all of the effects that happen from fire as a restorative process on the landscape, as a habitat renewal tool, as a way of sort of setting a balance and a resiliency on the landscape that mechanical treatments can try to emulate, but do not I don't think even the most adamant and experienced forester would claim that they can absolutely replicate the effects of fire. And because
I think they're different. They're totally different, right?
Totally.
Like, I mean, realistically, if you look at it, forestry is the way we do forest harvest is like we're trying to emulate natural disturbance because that's the best way we think to do it. And it makes sense to me. But you're right. Like a fire gets rid of all the little stuff, leaves the big stuff. Harvesting does the opposite, right?
Exactly.
So it's going to have different impacts. You're going to have different things going on. But yeah, absolutely. They're different. They're totally different disturbances for sure.
Yeah, I can see that you've given this a fair bit of thought and probably had other guests that have touched on this. So it wasn't like an easy, we'll just substitute this, because obviously fire is a little too spicy in fuels that have been affected by mountain pine beetle. So we still look for ways of how can we make this reasonable. And what we came to the realization is that either we would have to accept a highly elevated period of risk while the needles remained up in the canopy and waited until those fine fuels fell out of the canopy before we'd be back in a reasonable risk situation, or we needed
to cross your fingers.
Exactly.
I hope
that there is an ignition. Yeah. And you know what? We actually, it sort of turns out that there wasn't ignition towards the west of town in the intervening years. In hindsight, maybe we could have put that off and used the hopeful approach, but it's just not reasonable when you have the numbers of people that come to a community like Jasper, 2.5 million visitors in a single year, and a local population that expands from the just under 6,000 residents to 20,000 with seasonal workers. It's just not an approach that we would ever take, because we are quite focused on, while we want to restore ecological integrity and meet our mandate, at the same time, we have to make sure that we don't put people at risk. And that's our number one priority, is making sure that everybody's okay. So it meant that we needed to approach things differently. And there was a different impetus that was helped along by certainly events like Fort McMurray, like the Slave Lake fire, like series of very, very busy fire seasons in British Columbia. And there was I think a realization or a public appetite to recognize that, this might not be a comfortable move to switch to this other tool and to postpone, because I wouldn't say we replaced or in any way decided we weren't going to be pursuing a prescribed fire program that would bring that important renewal process back on the landscape. But it's how do we make it reasonable in the interim and address this elevated threat, which is what sort of brought us to the place where, let's just make sure that we do it right. And that means setting it up that, we have certain interests and objectives to ensure that the post-log landscape looks a certain way and is able to perform ecological functions a certain way. And if we're going to be happy with that end result and not just with the fuel reduction benefit, then we better be pretty careful about how we spell it out and who we engage to do that work for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add, I mean, we started talking here about the sort of how did we come to the idea or the acceptance that we are going to see mechanical removal happen in a national park here. And I think, at the peak of the pine beetle outbreak here in Jasper, that was certainly a discussion point, and it's uncomfortable for, I've spent my career working in our national parks and, trained as a biologist, and I've always looked at this this is about protecting and preserving this environment, and logging is something else.
Right.
We'll hear from Kari in a bit about how logging is not always not always a bad thing. In this case, it's never a bad thing. It's if it's done right. But we'll hear about that in a moment. But when I first arrived here, that height of that pine beetle thing, that was back in 2017. The summer of 2018 specifically, that was a hot, dry summer. We're surrounded by red, dead trees in the landscape all around the community now. And it was a bad fire year in BC that year. And we spent the whole summer not being able to see the mountain view here because of the smoke in the air. And that, I think, was really a turning point with the community and the public perception that we have to do something. Because everybody was on edge that summer thinking, is this the year that we're going to see something significant happen in Jasper? Because you couldn't get away from the smoke. You'd feel like you're smoking a pack a day, every day when you get home from work, and your clothes smell like forest, wood fire smoke. It was an unpleasant summer. Everybody was on edge. And that's when we really started the push for, no, something has to happen here. And I think in a way that uncomfortable summer really helped shift the perspective that we need to take, what could be viewed as extreme measures in a national park to do some logging. And that's where we really managed to get over that hump mentally. I think that we're going to bring in this tool. We need to find somebody we can work with that can do this right to the standards we need so that the landscape can continue to perform its various other ecological functions, as Landon mentioned. But I think that summer of 2018 was critical in that mental shift. Locally, anyways, that this has to happen
for the public.
And that I remember, David, your messaging, because Matt, we often throw poor David behind the microphone because he's much more articulate than some of the rest of us. He's
the politician amongst you.
I remember David always made a point when he would talk about the areas that we were going to be mechanically treating that one of the primary objectives for those is that it would allow us to use fire at a landscape level on the other side of those treatments. And so even when we're employing a tool that is being used to mitigate a fire concern, that goalpost is still getting fire back on the landscape, getting a natural role, building up a resiliency on the landscape that we really, were given a stark lesson of what happens when you have an absence of disturbance and different age classes and different forest structures out there. And that's what mountain pine beetle was able to very ably demonstrate for us on the landscape. And especially when you step into a mountain environment, it's like it's projector screens all around you. And it really made us feel like we were the poster child for mountain pine beetle because it was on display for folks and it wasn't what they were expecting to see when they came to a national park.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I do find it interesting. Like, I know, like, in our society, we've had this aversion to, like, the parks are supposed to be this, like, fortress kind of situation, right? Like, it's the park, leave it alone, let it do its thing. But the problem is it's not, right? The park is what it is because we made it so. We stopped the fire. It became homogeneous. We got Indigenous people off the land, basically no cultural burning. We did all this stuff, and then climate change, right? Which is, you can blame pine beetle on climate change almost entirely for the scope of it, right? So this situation that we're in is one of our own making, right? It's human beings that created this, and it would be foolhardy for us to think that, well, nature will figure it out. It's like, well, what nature is going to figure out isn't going to be what you're going to want. It's just going to burn everything, and there's going to be no community, and there's going to be nothing left. And it's like, so this is a problem that humans created. Why not use all the tools that humans have to sort this problem out, right? I find it, like, I mean, I'm a forester, right? So I'm obviously, I totally believe in sustainable forest management and doing things right that way, right? And that logging can be a solution to a lot of things. But I do understand as a park representative why you're like, well, the public's not going to like this, and we are working for the public, so how do we deal with this? And so but it's interesting to hear that even the public now is on board, that even they're realizing that, no, this is a situation, maybe they don't understand that this is a situation that we've created, but they understand it's a situation that needs to be dealt with, and that we need to use all the tools at our disposal to accomplish this. And also, for one more last thing here, is I think about if you were to do prescribed fire, if you were able to do it right around town there, right? It's not like that's a safe place for people to go hiking and walking their dogs and that kind of thing. You're going to have snags, you're going to have deadfall, it's not, whereas if you do mechanical right around town there, if you do the mechanical fuel removal, all of a sudden it opens things up and you can do those things, right? It creates more browse. There's all kinds of benefits that can be had. And you don't have that fear of deadfall and that kind of thing, right? So I do see lots of different positives towards this angle, right? It's interesting.
So just a little bit on that. I think we'll get into how we got into the relationship with Canfor, I'm sure, here fairly quickly, but
that's next on the docket. Yeah. We got two more people in this conversation
that's
that
right.
had to speak.
That's right. So we got to make some space for them. But that shift in the sort of local mindset, I think it was really interesting to watch, because after that hot, dry summer that I talked about earlier, when the logging trucks actually started rolling through town, like that was a bit of an eye-opening moment, I think, certainly for me and for a lot of other people. When you picture Jasper, a bit of a sleepy mountain town, suddenly there's we had to bring those trucks straight through the middle of town to get them onto the highway and to get the logs on their way out of the park. And that's just something that I think nobody ever imagined they'd ever see is, logging truck after logging truck.
I'm sure that wasn't easy.
Right through the middle of town, but it was amazingly well received. We didn't receive any sort of negative that I can recall. We had no pushback on why this has to happen. And in the intervening years, we'll talk about what's happened since then, I'm sure a little more as well. But you're right, it's opened up that landscape. There's not much in the way of snags to worry about. And the public reception to that has been phenomenal. The views are great up there now, way better than they were before when you were stuck in the middle of a pine forest. You can actually see the mountains from places where I'm sure 100 years ago you probably had a mountain view, and since then it's all been grown in with pine trees. And people really enjoy that. There are some negatives as well to that. We're concerned about what that means for increasing bear attractants on the fringes of the community, because the berry production up there has gone up, that kind of thing. So it's not all positive. There's other management issues that now we're dealing with because of that, because of that work. But overwhelmingly well received, certainly, even with those daily trucks hauling right through the middle of town.
That's incredible. Yeah, we're really in a shift in society, right? And of course, like you said, there's going to be pros and cons of any application that you try to do, right? So, but no, it's very, very cool. All right, so obviously, Parks went through a rigorous process to get this approved, and through another rigorous process to find the right folks to do this job. It's a sensitive job. You want all of the values to be considered and treated, balanced equally, so that we can do this differently. Just quickly, why did you guys choose the Canfor to do this?
One of the biggest hurdles in getting the approval here that you mentioned was the idea of actually taking resources out of a national park. As you mentioned earlier, this is, as you said, the fortress sort of idea. We're protecting these resources for people to enjoy in a different way. And the Canada National Parks Act is not set up for us to take resources out of the park and use them in any way other than that kind of enjoyment and education. And one of the principles we tried to follow here is that we want this to be as low cost to Canadians as possible. There's value in the wood. So we wanted the value in that wood to help pay for the project, to offset the cost of the project. But there's no mechanism established for how do we turn wood on the landscape in a national park into money to pay for the project. So that was a hurdle in itself to figure out, well, how do we adjust here? Because it's not like Crown land outside of the national park. This is governed by the Canada National Parks Act, and we never built that act with the intent that we will pay for work to happen based on the value of the resources. So we managed to get through that hurdle first and accept that, yes, we built a process that allows us to actually turn that wood into money to pay for the project. Yeah. So that was the biggest hurdle to get over. And then we had to go into so it wasn't a normal contracting process because of that. We're well versed in managing contracts where we are receiving a service from somebody and paying for it. But to pay for it with the value of the resources turned it into something more akin to a realty process instead. So that was a challenge. But once we got through that challenge and then we applied our normal contracting principles to go out and look for the right player to come in and do the work. And Landon, maybe I'll let you talk about that process.
Yeah. So I would say, Matt, it was definitely in our minds that it needs to be a competitive process. This is for the public interest. It needs to be above reproach in terms of how the selection happens. And so we selected 3 companies that had the capability to undertake a large scale project from, the access through the harvesting, through the processing and then trucking out the logs. And so we did site visits with folks, and they were free to check out the area that we wanted treated. And in the end, we had 3 bids, and the bid that felt like was going to work the best for the people of Canada. I don't want to sound like I'm trying to be pompous. That's just how we have to have to think and approach it. Came Absolutely. From Canfor, and I think in part it's because Canfor has recognized that it's important to have a forest ecologist, and I would say one of your guests here today really helped make the process palatable to Parks Canada by her expertise in ensuring that we're having an ecologically sensitive approach to this kind of work. So maybe I'll
absolutely
pass it over here back to you.
Yeah. So, okay. Kari, it is Kari, right? That's how you say it?
It is.
Okay. Yes. I'll make sure Kari, okay. Kari. All right. So you're sitting at the office and all of a sudden you get an email that Jasper wants to log around town. You go, okay. What goes through your mind? What was your reaction? And yeah, just walk us through that process for you personally.
Well, I actually got a phone call from one of our staff that keeps an eye on all the requests for bids and requests for proposals that come out. And he was fantastically excited. He called me up immediately. This was not an email thing. This was a phone call. And he was so excited. And he said, Jasper has put out a request for bid for logging. They want logging in the park. I'm like, what? You're kidding. You've got to be kidding. And he's like, no, I'm serious. And we started talking about it.
Is it April 1st? I don't know what's going on.
Yeah. Well, and, we knew about the pine beetle up there. It's a lot of us, we're all outdoor folks, we recreate all over the landscape, and people knew that it was a big issue there. And so we weren't that surprised, I guess, in a sense, to see it. But we were really excited. And so we jumped at the chance to have the opportunity to be able to demonstrate what we could do in Jasper. Certainly we were interested in the wood. For us, it was primarily lodgepole pine. It was good wood. It had the right profile. And we had the right equipment to be able to do the job. And we also had a lot of experience working collaboratively with all sorts of folks, like universities, local parks in the area, local communities, doing these types of projects before on like wildland, urban interfaced harvesting to reduce fire risk around communities, doing experimental logging for research projects, and just doing lots of work that required really a light touch and consideration of all sorts of different values. So we knew that we could come in and do a really good job here. And so I helped put the proposal together, coming up with some different strategies and different ways that we thought we could address the objectives. And we put in our bid. And then we were super excited when we were chosen. So, and also, I would say very nervous.
I think that's the right approach, right? I think that's the right approach. You're like, okay, we're going to log a national park. Oh, shit.
That was it exactly. Especially when we started talking to our contractors. They're like, oh, man, we can't screw this up. This was, I had nightmares for so many nights about, Canfor destroys national park across the headlines on the newspapers and stuff. So,
right. Well, obviously, I think most importantly, what I've gathered from everyone talking yet, and still we have a Shelley we're going to talk to soon. Eventually, she's responsible for some of the logging that's happening currently, some of the mechanical prescriptions that are happening currently. But I get the idea that the parks was looking for the right people with the right headspace, the right values, the right intentions, the right way of going about this, right? And clearly that's how they selected it, was making sure that the people that are going to be doing this work have the values in mind to treat this like a park and not like a forest management area or whatever. So, and actually, Kari, we didn't introduce you yet. So maybe you want to just introduce yourself, your role, and just real quick. And then actually, after that, I do want to talk. I want to get into pretty in depth into how this differed for you, because I listened to the little documentary that Fuse Consulting put out regarding this, and I was really captured by your statements talking about how different this was and how much different perspective you gained through this process, and how maybe the value shift happened while you were doing this, right? So first introduce yourself, and then let's get into the differences between this logging and how it's changed. Yeah.
Sure. My name is Kari Stuart-Smith, and I'm the manager of biodiversity and wildlife for Canfor. I'm based out of Cranbrook, but I work for our Canadian woodland operations in BC and Alberta. And
awesome. Okay.
I've been involved in sort of natural disturbance ecology for almost 30 years now, I guess. In fact, I did my PhD work comparing songbird communities in areas burned by wildfire and in logged areas. So I've done a lot of work on that, and really spent my career trying to help our operational folks with the development and implementation of strategies for sustainable forest management and how we can mitigate the impacts of logging on wildlife. And done a lot of collaborative work with universities and governments and First Nation communities and local communities, just on working to implement sustainable forest management strategies, around the province.
Absolutely.
Primarily in BC. But,
absolutely. So that's great. Perfect. Thank you. So going into this, you talked about, you had nightmares. You're worried about screwing this up. We got to have the right values at play. We got to have the right headspace. We got to be collaborative, right? The word collaborative kept coming up, and, we can't do this the way we normally do this. We have to include a bunch of maybe not even include other values, but we have to weight the other values heavier than we normally would, right? Because I know in forest management, we're always keeping tabs on all of these values, biodiversity and water and recreation and Indigenous values, all that stuff's considered, but the way it's weighted is different, right? So how did the weight of those values change for this logging process for you, and how much of a how much of a shift was it for Canfor to change their mindset to do this a little differently?
Well, it was very interesting because we came in seeing this project as having two objectives. I mean, the primary one was to reduce the canopy fuel density, to reduce the risk of severe wildfire to the town of Jasper, as David and Landon have spoke. And then the second one was to maintain ecological integrity. And we placed the first objective, for us, that was the primary objective. And the maintenance of ecological integrity, things that were very important for parks, like minimizing soil and ground vegetation disturbance, avoiding disturbance to wildlife during sensitive periods, maintaining key recreational trails, and making sure that there was coarse woody debris on the ground to emulate natural disturbance and to help prevent the creation of new recreational trails. Those were all things that we were very cognizant of and trying to do. But for us, they were secondary to the main objective of reducing the fuels. But what became quite clear to us as we went through the project, that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Landon, but I think you folks saw those two objectives as being equal. And so for us, it was a bit of a mind shift that we had to start placing those other things on the same level as the reduction of fuel. And it was more challenging for us. We're used to basically having objectives and then figuring out the methods by which to achieve those and being fairly flexible on how we can do those. Whereas with the parks, there were very prescribed methods by which everything was supposed to be done. And there were a lot of little details that were written out. And I think if you were to take any one of these things, most of them made a lot of sense. But what we found is when we tried to apply them all concurrently, that it didn't always work very well in terms of both the logistics or the economics for us. And so we had to try and figure out a way around that. And I'll just give you an example.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Because of the real concern, and a very valid concern, around minimizing soil and ground vegetation disturbance. And that was because, we don't want the establishment of any invasive plants or noxious weeds within the park. So right. It was prescribed that no skidders were allowed to be used. So we were using a harvester forwarder combination and processing at the stump. And so that leaves a lot of small and moderate sized woody debris on the ground. And the machines can travel over that debris, which then protects the ground from disturbance. We were also logging only in the winter on dry and frozen soils, which again offers another level of, or another degree of protection. Mm-hmm. But what we also had to do was get rid of that finer debris, because it is also, that increases the fire hazard. It dries out very quickly, and it can really spread a fire very fast. So one of the other requirements within the contract was for us to pile and burn that smaller stuff. And so that requires another machine to come on site, an excavator, to pile that into piles. And these piles had to be small, no bigger than 3 by 3 by 3 meters, and at a specific density. I think it was no more than one every 100 square meters or something. So there was a lot of very, very specific stuff. And we were trying to do all these things at once. Oh, and then, sorry, I almost forgot. There was a requirement to retain coarse woody debris, which are essentially logs larger than 7.5 centimeters, but preferably larger ones, on the ground to emulate the natural disturbance. So when you get a fire, a lot of the trees that are burnt fall down onto the ground. And the contract specified 60 cubic meters to be retained. But the standing volume within the stand to start with was only about 140. So it was almost half of the volume that we were supposed to, cut and leave on the ground.
Oh.
And we didn't realize that until we really got into the project and actually did some detailed cruising of the stands, and it became quite apparent to us that we couldn't do that economically. We simply couldn't leave that much on site. And also we felt that would not be achieving the project objectives of reducing the fuel hazard. And when we tried with our machinery to leave some of those longer pieces, but having 3 different machines on the ground, all moving around, they were crushing a bunch of that stuff. So it was just becoming very difficult for us as well. It was taking a lot of time for us to make those piles. And about half the blocks, we made 3,000 small piles.
Wow.
And then it was snowing every night, and we were trying to burn them at the same time. We were just falling so far behind in the work, and we were really nervous that we were not going to get this work done by mid-March, when the ground was going to warm up and there'd be a real danger of soil disturbance.
Yeah.
And so that's when, we really started talking to each other and saying, okay, is there something we can do differently here? How can we address this problem? We know what the objectives are, but what we're doing right now isn't working. And so Landon and I worked really closely together to come up with some alternatives. And we did a couple trials. And one of them was to use skidders. So we used a buncher skidder combination in a couple blocks instead of the harvester forwarders. And there was really 2 key things there that allowed us to do that. And one was a good snowpack. So there was, it was at least a couple feet of snow, wasn't there, Landon? Yeah. At that time. Plus, we had been doing some work in a campground. And maybe I'll just stop here. I've been talking for a bit. If you want to talk about the campground work that gave you the trust in the fact that the skidders wouldn't damage the ground, David or Landon?
I'll maybe add a few thoughts there. So, Kari's absolutely right in all the detail that we asked for from our end in our thinking that we needed to apply all these things to to preserve ecological integrity in the park. And as Landon mentioned earlier, some of these things evolved from our experience working with the pipeline going through. We have a whole set of environmental standards on what we're trying to do to make sure we minimize the impact of these kinds of disturbance. But I think one of the things that we've learned from this experience, and if were we to repeat it, we would do differently next time, is we didn't actually have a professional forester on our side of the table to look at these. To look at our project and think about, well, what is realistic here? What is realistic to ask of a forestry company, and
Gotcha.
what is unreasonable or won't necessarily be necessary to still achieve our goals? So we were coming at it from a very much a park protection sort of perspective, but without the right forestry perspective, I think, on our side of the table. So I'm sure, what Kari's alluding to and what Landon can speak to a bit is that we ended up kind of not in conflict, but looking at this problem from two very different worldviews and backgrounds, and even the language that we use is different from the language that a forester would use about how to do these things. So trying to make those things meet in the middle was an interesting challenge. And I just want to add an extra layer to the problem here as well that I don't think we've covered yet. The area that we were doing this work is what we refer to here as the Pyramid Bench, right adjacent to town. And this is the playground and the backyard of every resident in town. Extensive trail network through this area, mountain bike trails, walking and hiking trails, horse trails through this area. It's also important wildlife habitat, but this is very much on public display because everybody in town uses this area as their background. So we've got trails going right through the middle of these cut blocks as well. So it was always top of mind as well that not only do we have a mandate to try to preserve this environment, but we're also going to be very, very much on public display. As soon as things open up again in the summer, the density of use in that area is very high. People are right in the middle of where we've done this work. So that was always on our mind as well. One of the reasons for trying to maintain that level of coarse woody debris was not just to keep some of the material on the ground as well, to improve, moisture retention and all those things, but also to try to tackle the problem that we anticipated that if we just open this wide up, we're going to see a whole proliferation of the trail network, because now suddenly mountain bikers will be able to go wherever they want if there's nothing blocking them anymore. Those sorts of considerations as well came into the problem.
Absolutely.
So it was really an interesting layering of problems from our side, but then a lack of a common language to talk about these problems between us and between Canfor. So I think we handled that conversation really well. As Kari mentioned, Landon and her spent a lot of time coming to terms with that. We tried to approach it with an open mind and say, if you want to trial something different and show us that your way is actually going to work and achieve the objectives, let's go for it. Let's try it out and see what happens. And I think in the end that was very successful and saved us all a lot of grief. The campground project she's referring to, most people that are familiar with Jasper are familiar as well with the recent renovation that's happened at the Whistler's Campground. Whistler's Campground is the largest single entry campground in the Canadian National Park system. It's a big campground. I think Tunnel Mountain and Banff has a few more sites, but it's actually a few separate campgrounds considered in one block. This is one single entry campground, very large campground, and we had a project underway that we needed to redo the whole campground, all the utilities, all the water supply, and everything else in that site. But then the pine beetle came, as I talked about earlier, and basically killed all the pine trees that were in Whistler's Campground. So before we could let the contractors in there to do the campground rebuild, we needed to get the wood off that landscape. And that happened with a fairly quick turnaround, that we realized that, man, this is something that the construction contractors aren't going to be able to manage in an appropriate manner, but needs to be dealt with. So then we looked out and saw, well, actually, we've got Canfor engaged here in this contract. Let's broaden the scope a little bit and put them on the ground in the campground there and get that wood off the campground as quickly as possible so we can proceed with the campground construction project. And I think that's what...
You need the right people for sure. You don't want to be giving the wrong people the wrong job, right? Use the right tools.
Absolutely. And that's where they came in with the other types of equipment to do the campground work for us. And it was really an eye-opener, I think, for us on our side of the table to see just how delicately they could bring this equipment in and do that work. This is a campground. There's a lot of infrastructure there. There's road surfaces and, picnic sites and all that kind of stuff, buildings all over the place in there. It's not just an open patch of forest. We're going in to take the wood off. There's all sorts of obstacles. I mean, I assume it would be like trying to be a logger in an obstacle course, that normally you don't see that happen. You're just in there to cut the trees down. But now you have all this stuff in the way. So it was a real great chance to see that, you can actually do this kind of work very delicately and without a huge amount of impact if you're careful and set your objectives carefully.
Well, I think that's what I gathered from the whole documentary, the short documentary that I watched, was that this is a real collaborative win, right? Like you said, you're coming from very different perspectives, right? You've got this parks conservation approach, and then you've got the forest industry approach, right? And you maybe don't even have the same terminology. And the fact that you've been able to come together and sit down at a table and have the disagreements and have the hash out the details and try and get on the same page. The fact that you're able to accomplish that, I think, is the big win here, right? That you're able to see eye to eye and see how, okay, this is how we can do this, because there's going to be misconceptions from everybody about everybody else, right? So hashing those out early and getting it sorted, I think that's the big win that I see here, that I see it's something that I think can be applied to the landscape level for forest management in general, right? Not just with parks, but with forest management, like with mills, talking with like NGOs and talking with the communities and talking with the First Nations and talking with everybody, right? If everyone can come up with that collaborative approach, I see the ultimate win and the ultimate version of forest management taking over. And I see this parks situation as an excellent experiment on doing probably some of the most delicate forest harvesting that anyone's ever tried to do in Canada, right? With the most number of values that are equally weighted, right? Like I'm sure Kari knows, like the forest management in a national level, usually we can treat all these other values as constraints, right? So we just constrain what we do to not have a bad impact. But this is a different thing. Now we're not just trying to not wreck the resource. We're actually trying to create and build and construct more of those values, those non-timber values on the landscape, while also paying for all that work and reducing fire hazard and doing all this kind of stuff. I just get excited about all of it, right? It's very, very, it's very cool. I see it as kind of maybe opening up the door for more of these kind of conversations and that sort of thing, right? The collaboration, the communication, all that kind of stuff. It's how long did it take you to sit down and try to get these ideas hashed out? So
Matt, maybe I'll jump in just because I had a thought about something that was raised, and maybe if I can just plant a little foreshadowing that part of the solutions that we came to that David planted a seed for is that we needed to deal with sort of that cultural difference and language difference almost by having somebody who was fluent in the language of forestry. And that will be, your other guest on this podcast when she comes in later. But
right after you're done talking.
Exactly. But I think there was kind of a pivotal meeting that Kari and I kind of realized we both needed when the direction of the work was starting to devolve into sort of just operational opposition, and it involved primarily on the ground contractors who are very good at doing the things that they've always done, and our kind of surveillance personnel who are very good at remembering, no, this is what we said we were going to do. This is what you've signed up for. And on a small project, that's fine. And it actually doesn't carry on for long enough to create a lot of friction, and you usually resolve it fairly quickly. But this was a different scale entirely. and I remember, for Kari, because this wasn't just this project, it it represented a chance to really showcase what their company in Canfor could accomplish, that it was really important to get it right. And that was something that really struck me, that, okay, we're actually both on the same page with that. So that's a great starting point. We both want to get it right, and we both want to feel good about it at the end. And so
a bit of a misconception going into it, maybe, that you needed to train them on what you wanted, but
exactly,
it turns out they're on the same page.
Yeah. And sort of to abandon our probably equal cliches, and maybe Kari can speak to whether he had some, but certainly it's like, well, we got to defend against the big greedy timber company, and Kari's probably thinking, we can't let these tree huggers push us around. Like, they want us to do this job, and they don't know what we need to do. And I think, that might have been in a little bit of our subconscious, but we both spoke a pretty common language in terms of, okay, what my main concern and what I've seen as an ecological legacy of any large scale project is ground disturbance. If you can start with that ground disturbance problem and prevent it from the very beginning, then the land recovers quite well. But in a place like the Rocky Mountains, with thin soils and just poor growing conditions, a fairly dry site, things don't come back very well if they've been damaged or impacted. And
protect the baseline. That's really it's the pedestal from which everything else is built.
Totally.
So you got to keep that okay, and everything else can come back. But if you wreck the soils react.
Exactly. And we have legacy projects from early on in the park's establishment where 75, 100 years on, those scars are still evident, and it still hasn't recovered, and nobody wanted that kind of a legacy. And we had folks like the operations manager for the project, who was also on side with wanting to achieve, a good legacy from this project, but starting to feel frustrated, like there was no way he was going to be able to be successful. And I think we set a tone at that meeting, Kari, where we all recognized, okay, this is what we really want to achieve. We want to have the soil be as unaffected as possible, while still getting the logs off, having all of these other ecological considerations. The small pile thing was all about, again, soil disturbance, and the coarse woody debris was a multiple reasons and objectives, and one that we didn't really touch on is the fact that large fuels like logs, those don't contribute to fire spread. They can contribute to sustaining a fire, which is not the same kind of concern from a fire protection perspective. So, I think I started with something like, okay, let's first start with what we're viewing as the problem. Our problem is needles and tiny branches. and your problem is you want to effectively remove logs so that this project makes sense to you. But we'd be happy if those logs stayed standing and you could remove all the tiny branches and needles for us. And Kari's like, yeah, we don't have that equipment. So,
you mean you don't have this giant rake that covers 20 meters? And you can just rake through the forest, pull up all the branches?
I have seen a German tool that goes up a tree and trims it in plantations, trims all the lower branches for thinning out plantations. But yeah, nobody's contracting that service out. So it wasn't really an option on this project. But in all seriousness, treating this large area and recognizing that, okay, let's start with those fundamental principles. And that allowed Kari and Andrew, the operations manager, to start saying, okay, well, to do that, you're saying you want a smaller footprint of ground disturbance. What you're requesting in terms of road construction is going to give you a larger area of ground disturbance. If we do this kind of road cut, it's going to end up being smaller and we'll achieve your objective. And it's like, and it meant sort of giving up some of that control of like, no, we've said it has to be done this way, but establishing a certain level of trust with some other projects that were being successful and small steps together that we were able to okay, no, this is working. And, and that's what led into the campground project of where we're like, well, now we've got the snow cover and the equipment doesn't have to do a lot of turns on the tracks. And we don't have to preserve the asphalt because we're tearing up the roads and repaving. So we can't, if you say the operators can move in this environment and not damage all the other infrastructure we're trying to keep, then let's do it. And we were able to be at that place for that phase of the work that was being done. And I think it made a big difference. And now I've talked again too much and it should be Kari speaking to this.
Hey, there's 5 of us here. That's what I said this at the beginning. This is 5 people. It's hard to get it all in. But I think what I find interesting too is like you said, right? You both came in with both groups came in with preconceived notions of what the other group is like, and breaking down that judgment and opening it up so that both sides can be open and honest and vulnerable to be like, they can listen, these are my values, this is what we need, and to kind of get that understanding and that trust, like you said, right? That's the collaboration point. It's funny how I've talked to a few different groups. There was like a grizzly bear collaboration group up in like Peace River that had all these stakeholders, and they did the same kind of thing. And it's funny how no matter where anyone came from, when you did sit down at the table, when you did start opening up about your values, your deep values, and the deep things that you want and your expertise, and you start to create that trust, like, oh, they're opening up, they're being vulnerable here, let me do the same. Obviously, this person is someone trustworthy. And how, no matter where you come from, as long as that conversation is being managed appropriately, and everyone kind of comes, all of a sudden everything starts to come together, right? And you start to see how other people see it, and you start to trust more. And that's the real story, I think, of collaboration, right? Is that if we can be open and vulnerable and honest, we can get this to an awesome place, because everybody here has skill set. Everybody here has knowledge base that needs to be applied, but they're only going to be applied effectively if we work together. And it takes that trust. And I think that's a huge part of it. Absolutely. So, now jumping into Shelley. So you were brought in to manage some of this harvesting and some of the stuff that's going on now. So tell us your story. First, introduce yourself and how you got into this role, and kind of how you see yourself in this role.
Okay, great. So my name is Shelley Tamelin, and I more recently started in Jasper with the team there as their wildfire risk reduction project manager. And my background is as a professional forester in province of BC. I worked for many, many years, a big chunk of my career as a professional forester, and then made a transition to working as a project manager for Parks Canada a number of years ago. And I've been doing that for about 10 years now. And the way that I kind of came to working in Jasper was I was working on a project up at the Mayette Hot Springs doing wildfire risk reduction up there, and connected with Landon and his team in Jasper, and they saw that I had the experience in forestry and wasn't scared to look at removing trees from a park to achieve objectives, and so they brought me over for short term to help with some of their projects. That's awesome. Talking about what we've been doing this last winter, we added a little bit more to the bench guard, the pyramid bench guard. We added another little piece to it. That was a mechanical tree removal with logging equipment. And then we started a new project over on the east side of the valley. This will be a new fire guard along up the signal. It's going to be called the Signal Guard. And we started that last winter, and it'll be working on it again next winter, and probably for a few winters following that. It'll be an iterative approach to creating a new fuel break.
Awesome. So you were kind of the missing piece. That's what David was alluding to, right? Like, okay, we're parks, we're biologists, we're conservationists, we're these people, right? Protect the thing. And then we have Kari and Canfor, and they're like, okay, we're the foresters, we're this, but we don't work for parks. We're not into their internal dialogue. We're not into what their values are. We don't know them, right? And so to me, that seems like probably the best decision you guys have made in this whole thing, is to bring in somebody that, like you said, that forester representation for Jasper. So what was it like for you to get this role? And did you see this as, how much of a challenge did you see this? Because I'm assuming it's different. It's a much different job than you had before, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's not a huge challenge, actually. It's just a great fit for my skill set. So I've got the forestry background and a lot of experience doing project management. So this actually, and most of that project management was with Parks Canada. So it kind of allowed me to take my experience with forestry and kind of an industrial commercial setting, my experience doing fuel reduction projects in parks, and then just kind of just marry those two together. So, it's a really great fit for me, because I know the language that the loggers speak, and I also know what Parks needs to achieve with their objectives, and I know how difficult it can be to do that given the contracting parameters that we have to follow. So, it's I can see Landon going,
Well, I was going to say I referred to like speaking different languages, like. Matt, I talk about fuel and habitat and somebody who only speaks forestry would talk about fiber and now I'm gonna mess up the language because I'm not fluently bilingual. But Kari actually was bilingual, and I think that was a key part of our process of she did speak ecology and spoke forestry, so that was very helpful for getting some of those translation requirements out. I would just say that Shelley's actually trilingual, because contracting and project management is also its own language, especially within a large organization. So she speaks forestry, ecology, and contracting, and that's kind of what we need for the times that we're in terms of some of the projects that still need to happen.
Right.
I think that if Shelley had been on the project when we had been working on it, we probably would have had a much easier time of it, because we wouldn't have ended up sort of in a little bit of a stalemate where we did in late January there, like you said, Landon, because we had people on the ground. Our contractor is sort of very kind of not blinders on, but fairly
focused.
Yeah. By the book. And same thing with your environmental officer, very by the book. And they were just running into a bit of a conflict there and not able to see the bigger picture. And I think what was so important, and the biggest lesson one of the biggest lessons that I learned from this, is you really need to focus on the objectives and the results, and just take a step back and say, what are we trying to achieve here? Let's not worry about trying to meet a specific landing size of no bigger than 30 square meters, or, a burn pile no bigger than 3 meters. But why? Why is that number in place? And what happens if we do something a little bit different? What happens if we try something different? Can we still achieve the objective that is so important, like Landon talks about? And, certainly working a lot of my career in the East Kootenay here, where we have such a problem with invasive plants, I understood immediately, the concern about damaging the soils and soil disturbance, and you just create that seed bed where invasive plants can get established. And once they're established, you've now got a lifelong battle trying to get rid of them. And obviously,
I think everybody can relate to that, right?
To that. Oh yeah.
I think everyone's
terrible.
got dandelions, right? Everyone knows how pain in the ass it is to get rid of dandelions. So just imagine that in a forest setting, right? Like it's problematic, to say the least. Yeah.
Matt, Oh, sorry, Shelley, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I really appreciate what Kari was saying there. I feel like when I started my forestry career back in the 90s, forestry was a very prescriptive type of activity done in a very, meticulous way. And then there was a paradigm shift there where we moved to a very results-based approach, where you're looking at what your objectives are that you need to achieve and how you can get there. And I'm trying to bring that to my Parks Canada projects as well. Instead of telling a logger exactly what they can do, what we need to tell them is what we need to achieve in the end, and then open it up to a range of different ways that it can be achieved. And so I'm trying to have my tenders not be so closed and so prescriptive that in the end we can't achieve the objective that we need to achieve because it's economically not feasible for anybody to bid on the work. So it's a really difficult tricky balance trying to do these projects in a park and to still find people that can bid on the work and actually, make a living off of it at the same time. So.
Yeah. Well, and take on the risk of being blamed for wrecking something too, right? Like, I'm sure that's a conversation Canfor had. Like, do we want to take on this kind of risk, right? Like, it's because there is a public perception piece, right? There's a, the public license thing, right? Like, so that is an issue as well. And like, so yeah, I can see that there's a lot to talk about and there's a lot to break down, but it's exciting. Like, I'm assuming that this is the first real effort like this that's been successful. And obviously it's gone well. Obviously you developed relationship and trust. And now I'm sure now the new logging operations that are happening are probably going a lot smoother because you're having that discussion about, okay, what exactly do we want? What are we trying to do? What values are we trying to protect? How are they weighted? How should I be making these decisions? Instead of, like you said, providing this very, very narrow path of don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that, do this. Now you just kind of keep the conceptual framework open and just keep it malleable and keep it changing. That sounds like that's kind of the way you went with it.
I have to throw in one anecdote because it won't jump out of my mind and I won't be able to think of anything else until I get it out. So Kari had mentioned the 60 cubic meters per hectare requirement for coarse woody debris. And I remember saying, like, where did this number come from? And it was something that came up during that video that you mentioned that Matt Piper had done. And he even was like exploring it. So why were we tied to this 60 cubic meters per hectare? And it was from a paper by Piper and Vinge that he had co-authored. And it was looking at boreal forest and coarse woody debris post clearing requirements for seismic activities and oil and gas exploration. And, absolutely relevant for that ecosite type. But Kari, I think, did a very good job of presenting a compelling argument for coarse woody debris that actually matched a little better fit for open solar facing slopes in kind of a Rocky Mountain environment that was slightly less and not the boreal environment. But I just like that sort of full circle of the universe that Matt, with the microphone. Now tell me about this 60. And Kari's like, wait, that was you. You're the
yeah. That's hilarious.
Yeah. That's funny, but that brings up just another point I want to touch on is that's how we resolved a couple of these challenges, not just the coarse woody debris one, but also the pile size was going to the science to look at what the science can tell us and how can that inform our practices. Because for the coarse woody debris, I went and looked at what the actual volumes were in the dry stand types in the pine dominated forests, and they were quite a bit lower. So we were able to use that number instead of the 60. And then for the pile sizes, digging into the literature, it was clear that it was actually the size of the pieces in the pile and not the actual size of the pile itself that determined the degree of soil scorch and vegetation damage. And so
how long it's going to burn, not necessarily
how hot it burns, really. As long as you keep those big pieces of wood out of the piles, then you don't end up with a lot of soil damage. And so we trialed, going up to like a 5x5 and even as big as a 7x7 and keeping those big pieces out. And we didn't really see any consistent relationship between soil damage and pile size. So therefore, we were able to use slightly bigger piles and fewer of them so the work could proceed faster and, achieve the results of no
really
ground
challenging all the preconceived notions, right? Like everybody's like, I want this. I'm like, oh shit, that's no good. Well, I want this. I'm like, well, that's not going to work either. And it's like really like every time you turn around, you're running into another issue very specific that, you both have ideas of, and then you find a middle ground somehow, right? That ends up being the right way. And it's fun, again, right? Bring it all back to collaboration, to trusting one another and come. It's like it really, really is the winner of this story to me from the outside perspective, right? It's just, it really says so much. So, Kari, I did want to ask, what kind of shifts within CANFOR have you seen as a result of this project? Have you noticed any changes that have evolved because of this?
Well, certainly the lessons that we've learned are exactly what we've been talking about, is that the more collaboration and sort of open and honest work that you can do with people up front, the better off the project's going to be. And I always find that going out into the field, like onto the project site with people and walking it and listening, being very open and listening to what people's values are and what their objectives are for that landscape, and recognizing that they don't always match our own, and that people do have different languages and cultures. And, maybe because we do quite a bit of fire interface, like fuel reduction now, and it's not always just about the fuel. There's lots of other things going on close to communities, like recreation trails, and people have got special places where they have their favorite wildflowers grow, and they don't want the logging equipment to go through there. So we've ribboned out special places for wildflowers, or someone has, they know that there's a den for a black bear over here, or these special things. And the thing is listening to people and working collaboratively with them and adjusting the prescription and doing that all up front. I think that's what we've learned, and I think we're better at it now and than we were before. And I'm not saying we're perfect by any means. We still have ways to go. And it's always a challenge trying to balance that with the economics of it.
Of course. Well, exactly. Like David said at the beginning, right? The government doesn't want to split this bill. We want to try and have it pay for itself if possible, as much as we can, because the public doesn't want to pay for this. And so the more economic you can make it, just the better off. We live in an economic world, right? That's just the reality of it. So the more we can balance those things out, the better. But you said something really awesome that I find is always true, right? The listening. Just listening. Because everyone comes into a situation with their ideas, their preconceived notions, and like, I have this thing that I need you to hear, and I need you to know it now. And everyone hears it, but they're not necessarily listening and reflecting and empathizing with that position. I imagine it took a lot of empathy from everyone to try to perceive where people are coming from, and the listening portion. Yeah, absolutely. It seems like that's something that we could pretty much resolve most of our society's issues.
I think so. And for our contractors, I recall many discussions with the contractors trying to help them overcome their frustration with not being able to just go and do things the way that they'd always done things, and just saying, look, guys, it's different here. You have to do things differently. And
it's very
different
cool.
doesn't have to be bad. Different is just different. No. But I think we often, and you were getting a little metaphysical there, Matt, and applying it to society. But I think that's, that could be a much broader message that a lot of people need to hear, is like, you can just think about things a little bit differently, and it doesn't have to be as polarized or as black and white or good and bad. It can just be different.
Imagine if politics was like that. Instead, they just point fingers and blame each other for everything, right? There's no sitting down and discussing the subject. They're just like, well, you did this stupid thing. Well, you said this back in the day, as if no one can learn from their mistakes, right? But that'll never happen. We don't need to get into that conversation. So, Shelley, actually, I wanted to ask you, how are things going now? So you've, like you mentioned, there's obviously this was a success. Obviously the public's on board. Obviously Parks is happy. Obviously CANFOR is happy. Obviously there is a lot of good things happening here, a lot of lessons learned. So you're responsible for some of the new projects that are happening around town. It looks like there's a lot going on. How is that going?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So, there's a few new projects that we were undertaking last winter, and I think they went really well, actually. People in the parks, who live in the parks and visit the parks, they're becoming used to seeing fuel treatments in the park, whether it's prescribed burn, whether it's hand treatments, and sometimes it's mechanical tree removal as well. And so we were able to complete 2 projects last winter. Like I mentioned earlier, one is directly adjacent to the Pyramid Bench Guard, small 10-hectare block, and that was a conventional logging that was undertaken. Very simple ground, done with a forwarder harvester type approach, and building on a lot of the lessons learned from the Pyramid project, which was directly adjacent. It's interesting because I'm sure Canfor had a learning curve with it all, but Parks Canada, of course, had a learning curve as well with that project. And a lot of those lessons learned went to David and to Landon, who then have passed those along to me. And we made sure to incorporate those in the projects that we were undertaking last winter and projects that we'll undertake in the future. So we finished that project off. It was about 10 hectares in size. And then later in the winter, we moved over onto the other side of the valley to start on a new fire guard that'll protect town from the east side. And in the Keith Lakes area, did about 13 hectares of conventional logging in that area as well. Again, with the same forwarder harvester setup. Kind of a mixed wood type. So in that block, we were able to leave quite a bit of aspen standing. Both blocks actually ended up with about 30% retention of live lodgepole pine and some smaller spruce, Douglas fir, and aspen, which was a challenge for the logger to try and work around all of that. For sure. In addition to the small pile sizes that we want and logging on, frozen ground, we ask a lot of loggers and we work closely with them every day to make sure that we can achieve our objectives. And so the second block that I was talking about, the second unit there over around Keith Lakes will be an anchor point for a new fire guard that we are planning up the side of Signal Mountain to protect the east side of the valley. And so that's something that I'm working on now, actually. Kind of doing all the planning and development consultations, and I'll be getting the approvals and funding in place for that one. And then we'll go to contracting and hopefully get some work done on that one next winter as well. And it'll be another mechanical tree removal, at least initially to start. It's a big guard. It won't be wide. It'll be a narrow guard. Kind of linking together some wet lands and some natural open mixed forest aspen types. And it won't just be a mechanical tree removal, but it'll kind of be an iterative approach. So while initially we'll be using some mechanical tree removal, certainly will be some hand treatments in there, and then down the road some prescribed burning as well. So it won't be exactly the same as the larger guard that we see, or the community guard that we see over on the Pyramid Bench. It'll be a different type of guard, but we will see some more logging happening in the park next winter.
So maybe I could jump back in. I've been sitting listening for a little bit.
No, you're not allowed. You're done. You talk too much.
Sorry.
Please do.
Shelley's right. We're making some great progress. Using this tool that we really had that exploratory use of, with the most significant single block, of course, has been what we worked with on Canfor there on the Pyramid Bench. That was a major undertaking. It was a major hurdle for us to get over, I think, mentally, and how we're managing this place. And like Landon said, not to move away from prescribed fire as our preferred tool, but really to bring back the possibility that we could do this safely in this environment. So just this spring, we had an objective of we hope to pull off a prescribed fire on the bench on what we're calling the Razorback unit, that's surrounded on two sides anyways by area that Canfor treated. That's part of the pushing this fire protection a little further. We weren't able to get that fire off just because of we got rain that greened it up a little faster than we anticipated when it looked like conditions were just coming into prescription. So that'll hopefully go this fall. But I think the thing I wanted to comment on the most here is that, that experience of getting over that mental hurdle with the Pyramid Bench unit has really opened the door a lot. But we had those challenges that we've talked about in coming to a common language and solving some of those problems. But the outcome there really speaks for itself. And when you go now and ride your bike around on the Pyramid Bench there, or go for a hike, those of us that know what happened there, that know that this was a mechanical wood removal, you can still see that. You can see the signs of it. But people that don't know what to look for there would have no idea what we've undertaken there, with no idea that we once had, skidders driving through that and haul roads and decks of logs waiting to be hauled out, and that it looked for a period like an industrial forest landscape. I've got a picture of myself in my Parks Canada uniform standing next to this massive log deck here in the middle of a national park, thinking that's not something I ever expected to see in my career. But I really enjoy now getting up there and seeing that, wow, we can enjoy this place and not have the feeling that we're walking through an old clear cut. It doesn't feel like that at all. Like we solved those problems that we were faced with, I think, in a way that has resulted in a really fantastic outcome there. And it's not that, we've reduced the fire risk to this community to zero. We've made a big step forward in reducing that fire risk, and it's an ongoing project. But that really got the community and got us in Parks Canada over that hurdle to think, we can look at that now and say, yes, we can proceed with more of this work with some of the lessons that we've learned and see a really good outcome, and then get ourselves back in a position where we can, rely on this where it's the appropriate tool and put fire on the landscape where that's the appropriate tool, and really try to use a combination of different tools to just increase the range of possibility here and continue to make these improvements.
Yeah. Look what trust can do, right?
Yeah.
Look what it can do. This is what we can accomplish. It's pretty awesome. Yeah. And I wanted to plant a seed here. It might be a seed that's already planted, but especially with Amy Cardinal Christensen working for Parks now, right? But now with these areas opened up, I wonder, it'd be very cool to see, because I know the cultural burning piece is something that is kind of be reviving now, right? And communities are starting to learn that they're trying to get this opportunity back, right? I wonder if that's something that is potentially on the books. I wonder if it's something that's going to come up, and that these areas where you have removed a lot of the dangerous fuels, where you might be able to provide that other opportunity where it's not just fuel reduction, but provide an opportunity to revitalize Indigenous communities that once held strong in Jasper, in that area, right? There might be opportunities there as well to not just deal with the ecological, but deal with the social as well, and maybe give back in that way, right? I think that would be cool, personally. I hope it happens.
Well, it's certainly a subject we're exploring. We've got a cultural use area set aside here in Jasper that it's a special place that our Indigenous partners can come and use for ceremony and gatherings and things like that. It's only the first, I think, of a push in that direction, which is great. We worked with Indigenous contractors this winter to improve to reduce fire risk in that area, and we have an ongoing conversation, that Landon's been pushing on here to try to find a way to bring some of that cultural burning back, to engage Indigenous partners in opportunities to put that Indigenous burning back on the landscape where it's appropriate and where it meets our objectives and their objectives. So we're not quite there yet, but it's certainly on our mind and something we're striving for in the future.
Absolutely. Well, you got Amy who works for Parks now, so you got the right person to talk to. Anyways, I know she's a very, very, very incredibly busy person, but but I know that this is her passion, right? So, that's cool. So, anything else? Does anybody have any kind of final thoughts they want to share to kind of put a cap on this whole conversation? I think we've done a good job of running the gamut, of explaining what's going on, how things are going to move forward. Obviously, there's with Shelley at the helm now, you've got more opportunity to actively do this kind of stuff, and the fear is gone, right, of using mechanical removal to do this kind of stuff. The fear is gone. The trust is there. The situation is primed for like kind of a new era of landscape management in parks, right?
There'll be some new errors as well.
Yeah.
There's a bit of a Freudian slip, I think. Yeah. But does anybody have any final thoughts they want to throw out there just to cap things off? And if not, that's okay as well.
I'd be interested to hear from Kari. Would Canfor ever log in a national park again after this experience?
Yes, I think we would. We would do some things differently, though, for sure, with some benefits of hindsight. Absolutely. Because we underestimated how long it would take us to do certain things. There were things in this project that we'd never done before, like the piling and burning. And that was the number one thing that we were really falling behind on. So with that, for sure. And then around the economics of it, absolutely. It certainly wasn't a big moneymaker for us. I'll put it that way. Not that we would expect it to be, but we need to think that through a little better as well, and how we approach that one. But I would love to do some more work in a national park.
It sounds like you learned a lot.
I think we all learned a lot. I'm wondering, Kari, have you been back in the recent last couple of years to actually see the outcomes there? I'm not sure if you've been back into Jasper recently.
Well, I was there in August of 2020 when we put the video together. Yeah. And so I walked through it then, but not since then. Although I do have plans to be up in about a month on my way up into northern BC for work. So I'm really looking forward to walking through the blocks then. And maybe I'll give you folks a call. We could do a walkthrough together of some areas.
Well, it just continues to get better up there. I think that as things come back and flower and everything else. So that would be good timing.
That's great. I'm really keen to see how it looks now. Yeah.
Well, thanks everybody. This was incredible. I think we managed to stick handle this conversation into a place where it's productive and people are going to learn a lot and kind of it's a feel good story. I love it. Kind of stuff we're looking for, right? I'm always looking for what's the next stage, what's the next step, what's the next advancement, and I think this is such a great example of the next thing, right? So thank you everybody for being involved. This is incredible. I can't wait to share it. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. I know it was there's a lot coming at you there, right? Talking about values and collaboration and listening and very specifics about harvesting and what to do, what not to do. And there was a lot going on. I'm glad you stuck with it. I learned a whole bunch and I couldn't be happier to have them all on. These kind of stories, I don't know, they provide a lot of spark, I think, for the future of forest management and the future of land management, the future of what we're going to do as a species when it comes to stewarding the landscape. I hope you got that. I know I got that out of it. So I hope you guys got it too. I hope you like that. And if you want to support this podcast, you can share it with your friends and family on social media. You can rate and review on Spotify and Apple Music, or Apple Podcasts, I should say. And just get it out there. It's free content. Get out there. Help me out. I appreciate it. Please, please, please. And that's it. Thanks a lot. We'll catch you next time.